Saints of the Americas is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church celebrated in the Americas. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Welcome to our show. We're going to talk now about St. Isaac Jogues and St. John de Brefeuf. We know that they're French Jesuits, but they're missionaries that come to the New World in the middle of the 17th century. Let's talk not only about them, but what's going on in this great wilderness, this vast wilderness.
Well, exactly that. It is a vast wilderness. And while we have our 21st century mindset of what it is to be in North America, to be in the United States, or what our neighbors to the north in Canada experience, it was a vast wilderness, but there were already people living in that vast wilderness. It was the Native Americans. And so often what happens is when a European country or another country, seeks to expand, much like the English coming to the United States and then the Spanish and the French, we see that both the English and the French start to expand into the territory to the north, into Canada, and a desire to kind of just set up shop and know what they knew in their other land. And so certainly they come and they encounter these Native Americans, and they come with their mindset of governance, they come with their mindset of religion, and they seek to want to impose that in some ways on the people that are already living here. And so we see that the French Jesuits were the first missionaries to Canada, seeking to Christianize the Native American population.
And it's interesting, as we had talked prior to the taping, when we think of Canada now, mainly parts of it, it's extremely Catholic, extremely French. And so that influence among these first missionaries really was long-lasting. Let's talk about that missionary work. We know that they were coming to a country that was really not established with any institutions or governance other than what was taking place in the Native American community. And so we also see that their coming to North America they experienced some great resistance. And the resistance probably was because they were sharing this faith with those who probably didn't understand it. But we see in the lives of some of the people experiencing and grasping and taking the faith onto themselves. But that was not something that happened readily. It was a slow process. And we see these two people plus their companions coming in this situation and then ultimately experiencing martyrdom. Let's talk about that whole sense of what a martyr is and why we lift those people up to the level of saints because of that experience.
Well, I think the first part of your question was that sense of the missionary work. And then it moves into the martyrdom, which goes hand in hand in many cases. I think the missionary work that Isaac and John and their companions and many others like them were called to was no different than what the missionary work of the early church was, and why there were challenges and resistance. Because although it's a new land, there's still structures. It's a tribal structure. But it's no different than what Jesus met himself. His teaching and his preaching and what he came to offer struck against the governmental authorities and their desire to rule. And so it's very similar, even though you don't have that structure of Rome in Jerusalem. You have tribal institutions that they have their own way of doing things, their own governance. Certainly a very dominating society, a very male hierarchical society. You come in and you want to try to teach and preach that all are created equal and all are created in the image and likeness of God, and all of that love and forgiveness. It strikes against all of that structure that's there. So it's those that are in authority are usually the ones that are most opposed. Because the ones who are most readily susceptible to conversion and to this faith are the ones that are being, kept down. And so you have all that difficulty. So then we want to transition into the sense of martyrdom. It is that sense of living the life of Christ. That at all cost we must preach the gospel, regardless of what it might mean to our own safety, our own well-being, that our purpose and our call is to preach Christ crucified, but it is that crucifixion that ultimately leads to the hope of the kingdom.
It's interesting because that really kind of leads to something that Isaac Jogues, when he returned to Paris after his first capture and torture, he wrote this to his superior. He said, "Yes, Father, I want whatever our Lord wants, even if it costs 1,000 lives." So there's that sense that he knew what he was getting into when he came to North America, and when he entered into this tribal area where he was going to share the faith. He knew that it was not going to be easy, but he was willing to lay his life on the line, similar to, as you had said, as Jesus has. And that's why we really elevate the martyrs, because what they've done is they've united themselves to Christ and his suffering on the cross, which is the perfect act of worship and praise. Let's briefly then talk about that whole sense of evangelization and how important that we continue that great mission of evangelization. And this is what these early French Jesuits were all about. And that's what missionaries are all about. And that's what we as church are all about, evangelization.
Well, and we've spoken in other episodes about how that missionary work and evangelization go hand in hand, and maybe the one is built on the other. For Isaac and John and their companions, they were missionaries in the truest sense of bringing the Word of God to a people who have never heard that Word, or never even heard of who Jesus was or what these Gospels mean. The transition perhaps into evangelization is we live in a world now where even if someone has never lived a faith, it would be very difficult to say that they have absolutely no knowledge of who Jesus is or what the Gospels are. You don't have to be a person of faith to have that academic knowledge. Jesus is a historical figure. The Gospels are writings. But it's how to invite people to take that to heart and to live it. And that work is exactly what the missionaries did. It might be to a different crowd or a different audience, one that already has some knowledge, but it's the same work of how to internalize it and then live it.
We're going to close with the opening prayer of the Mass, which says, "Father, you consecrated the first beginnings of the faith in North America by the preaching and martyrdom of Saints John and Isaac and their companions. By the help of their prayers, may the Christian faith continue to grow throughout the world." And we see that faith continue to grow through the lives of early martyrs and through our lives as well. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Available through St. Paul's Books and Gifts is a small treatise on peace of heart, both in book and audiobook form, by author Father Jacques Philippe, well-known preacher and retreatant from France. For more information on this item and many more, please visit the bookstore at 926 Boardman Canfield Road in Boardman, or call 330-953-2443, or visit their website at www.stpaulsusa.com. This book, Searching for and Maintaining Peace, is there to help you pursue peace of heart as a pure gift of God. Again, that phone number is 330-953-2443, or visit their website at www.stpaulsusa.com.
We are in our 7th year at Cristo Rey Jesuit High School. One of the things that's unique about this school is that our kids work 5 days a month at offices in downtown Chicago to pay for their education. We got telephone calls the first day thanking us for sending us those kids to their companies. 95% of our kids are the first ones in their families to finish high school, and 87% of our graduates are in college right now. No one believed that it would be as successful as it is. Well, it's obviously caught on, and we're very, very excited about it.
Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about Frère André. We know him as Saint André Bessette. Let's tell the folks about his early life.
His early life is one that you would not look at all other than faith. and think that he would be a saint that we're talking about today. He was the 8th child in a family of 12. He was given the name Alfred at his baptism, so we know him by his religious name, Andre. But what we know about him is that he ends up being orphaned at the age of 12. He tried his hand at a variety of trades to try to make a living and to try to get by. He was unsuccessful in all of them. Every endeavor he tried was a failure. We know that he could barely read or write, and that he was sickly throughout most of his life. So not exactly the story of one who is going to be promoted, into the realm of what we're discussing today. But we do know that at the age of 15, he became a Brother of the Holy Cross, but was rejected at the end of his novitiate. At that moment, of rejection, there's an insistence by the Bishop of Montreal that Brother Andre should be allowed to make a religious profession. So when I said everything else seemed to be a failure except for faith, there was something recognized in Brother Andre, that although he was judged by his superiors that this isn't going to work out, we're going to just call it a day, go on your way, stay warm and well fed. It is the Bishop of Montreal that insists that he be allowed to at least make this religious profession. And so that gives us Brother Andre.
It's interesting as you were talking about his ill health and frailty, yet he lives to be well into over 90 when he dies. And so there's this whole sense that the Lord had entrusted to him enough energy, enough health in order to do God's will. And that's what basically Andre's life was all about. He was canonized in the year 2010, many years after his beatification. And so it's interesting because this cult of Frere Andre continued to grow in Canada, and we see it continue today in St. Joseph's Oratory, which we'll talk about in a moment. But it's interesting because when we talk about certain saints, many of those people who were canonized and are canonized, we think of them as saints of centuries ago. But many of the saints are people that walked among us, that people that we know knew and understood. And so there's that whole intimate relationship that some people had with the saints who were here on earth. And what does that say about our relationship with the saints? We call ourselves a pilgrim people. We're a pilgrim church, and yet we're united with those who have gone to heaven. And let's talk about that relationship that we have as saints.
Well, I think it first serves as a reminder that we're all called to the sanctity of a holy life. We all have the possibility of ourselves being saints. We need to remember that none of the saints were perfect. Many of the stories of the saints are filled with stories of great conversion, of a dissolute life before they come into that encounter with Christ. But it's also a reminder to us to move out of that mindset that they are distant. I think you're absolutely right. Too often we think of the saints of the early church, people of old, that they all go back centuries, because we see them in statues and stained glass, and they've been part of the church for ages. Or if they are newer saints, they're people who ran religious orders, or they're popes. And so someone like Brother Andre reminds us that they are just humble servants of God who are in our current age and our current time. And we need to be open not only to recognizing them, but to living it in our own lives.
And let's go back to the oratory that really commemorates his life and his ministry and basically his devotion. We know that he was devoted to St. Joseph, but he was also devoted and had a commitment to the poor and to the afflicted. And so this oratory, like many of the shrines throughout not only Canada, but in other places throughout the world, really lift up those to whom these saints have ministered. And so what is so important and special about this oratory of St. Joseph?
Well, we know, as you said, he lives even with poor health a long life. One of his ministries for 40 years was the porter of Notre Dame College. But after that, he was needed full-time at this oratory. That he was responsible in helping to build. We know that it's built in honor of St. Joseph, and it's dedicated in 1955. It was raised to the rank of a minor basilica. But we know that this oratory became a place in which people from all over Canada and now beyond, many people in the United States are familiar with the St. Joseph Oratory in Montreal, where there was a recognition of this need to come and pray and make pilgrimage there, to invite God's healing presence. And Brother Andre really takes on this spiritual role of the spiritual ambassador of this healing, and dedicates it to St. Joseph. And we recognize in St. Joseph, of course, someone who cared for the Blessed Mother, cared for the Christ child, and who really, in his own humble beginnings, gives us this healing presence of Christ. And so that's what the St. Joseph Oratory seeks to model, and we know that it is littered with the stories and physical embodiment of people who are healed.
When you talk about Brother Andre and his relationship really to St. Joseph, we know Joseph is that just and pious man. Well, we know Brother Andre as that just and pious person who reached out to the poor, who had this tremendous devotion to Joseph and the church. And we know that at his death, that over 1 million people came to pay their respects to Brother Andre. And so his cult really continues today, and we continue to lift him up as a saint of God. I'd like to read the opening prayer, which says, Lord our God, friend of the lowly, you gave your servant, Brother Andre, a great devotion to Saint Joseph and a special commitment to the poor and afflicted. Through his intercession, help us to follow his example of prayer and love, and so come to share with him in your glory. So there's this whole sense that we take on the work of the Lord, whatever that work is. It was a simple work that Brother Andre experienced as the porter, as someone who welcomed people, who opened the doors of his life and the life of the church to people. And now he's sharing with God in glory. And that is really the call. As you had mentioned, we're all called to be saints. That is the ultimate goal for all Christians and all who follow the Lord, is to join him eternally in heaven. We're going to talk about another saint in a moment. Stay with us. We'll be right back. The Society of St. Paul announces a new book on Padre Pio by Italian journalist Stefano Campanella. The director of Padre Pio Television gives readers an intimate insight into this saint who Pope Francis appointed as one of the great patrons of the Jubilee Year of Mercy. This edition can be found at St. Paul's Books and Gifts at 926 Boardman Poland Road, located across from the Olive Garden restaurant. This book on Padre Pio talks about his time in the sacrament of confession with countless of Catholic pilgrims, and as a contemplative saint whose life was blessed in countless ways. Visit St. Paul's Books and Gifts Monday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. or call 330-953-2443 or email at stpaulsbookstore@gmail.com to learn more about Padre Pio and many other great saints of the Catholic Church.
Well, I've been volunteering for 18, almost 20 years for volunteer chore service for Catholic community services. What I do is help the elderly in their homes so that they can stay in their homes. I do work from shopping to housework to yard work. Most of the people I see don't really have a lot of family, so then I become almost like their family.
I think a lot of times the elderly in our society are forgotten, and that's unfortunate because they're a real important part of our community because they have so much wisdom to share.
Doing this type of work is very rewarding. You can't put it into words because I learned so much from these people, and you learn stuff about yourself too. You learn to see God in a variety of people, in a variety of settings. The other day she told me that every night when she goes to bed, she thinks about her little angel, when her little angel's going to come and check on her the next day. And that's me, yeah.
By the time we can walk, each of us yearns for the joy that comes from being able to do for ourselves. Church World Service believes that being self-reliant is a joy everyone should share. So around the block, or around the world. Share the joy. Church World Service.
Welcome back to our show. We're going to talk now about Saint Junipero Serra. He's got a rich life, a very interesting life, and he's another missionary. So let's talk about his life.
Well, he was born in Spain, the son of a farmer, and yet early on felt the call to religious life. He joins the Franciscan order in 1730, and that's when he takes the name Junipero. He's a very educated man. He actually received his doctorate in theology and taught philosophy in the universities in Spain prior to his sailing to Mexico. Again, that call to go and to become a missionary, to evangelize in these newer lands in the Americas. We know that as he set sail for Mexico en route, he preaches his first sermon in the Americas in San Juan. In Puerto Rico. We know that he then, for 8 years, preaches extensively throughout Mexico, and he also holds various positions within the community as he's going about preaching. One of them was that he was involved in the Holy Office of the Inquisition. However, we know that in this early missionary effort, eventually there are other forces and factors going on in Mexico. The government. We've talked before about how sometimes missionaries encounter these difficulties because what they are preaching goes contrary to the rule of government. This idea of equality and ministering to the lowly and the downtrodden. So we know that at one point in 1767, all of the Jesuits, all of the religious are expelled from Mexico, and that's how he then ends up in California.
Yeah, it's interesting because when we think of Junipero Serra, our minds automatically go to California, because anyone who has traveled extensively throughout the state knows that he had established many missions and many churches and chapels along the whole way up and down the state of California. And of course, this whole missionary work, which really began in his own country, but continued here in the States and in Mexico, was very, very important and very necessary. And we would have thought that Mexico would initially have been a Christian country, but it wasn't. And like many of the territories of the New World, they would have been tribal. They would not have been Christian or religious at all. And so these missionaries come into this land, this vast territory, to put down roots, to share the gospel. And then we see, as you had mentioned, they were expelled, but that didn't stop their work. His work continued throughout California. And we know his dedication to the Native Americans was really vast. He experienced and celebrations of the sacraments. Let's talk about some of the numbers of the people that he really encountered and that he ministered to sacramentally.
One of the things that we know about his life is that at one point they've tabulated that there were over 6,000 baptisms. So imagine that in today's parishes, having that number of baptisms throughout any priest's ministry in a particular parish or community. As you mentioned, it really was once they were expelled and he finds his way into California, again, preaching and teaching, he still implores the Spanish method of administration for the missions. He frequently came into conflict with civil and military authorities. He became an advocate, speaking out of the mistreatment of Native Americans. And one of the things we know is that he became one of these itinerant preachers, riding horseback from community to community, but really seeking to evangelize and to invite more people into the faith. And so, as you mentioned, that gets him expelled from Mexico, the tribal structure, the governmental structures. Although there was a little more freedom to do that in the United States, perhaps there were those that wanted to define the people to which he was to go to. And he saw that need to always expand and to always move into new territories and to invite new people into this faith.
We know that also in 1935, he had died in 1784, but in 1935, the Serra Club was founded, and that really is a club that welcomes and encourages and promotes vocations to the priesthood and religious life. And it really was founded in Seattle, Washington, not only to foster vocations but to promote Catholicism throughout the United States. And it was officially established as Serra International in 1938. So we see that cult of his as a missionary really continue among our own people, to invite others to consider priesthood, to consider religious life. And we know in our own dioceses throughout the country that many of them have this apostolate, reaching out to those who study in the seminaries and those who study in convents, and promoting that whole sense of priesthood and religious life. Let's talk briefly about his beatification ceremony, where John Paul II said that Junipero Serra was a shining example of Christian virtue and the missionary spirit. His great good was to bring the gospel to the native peoples of America so that they too might be consecrated to the truth. So there's that whole sense that we know his beginnings with the Inquisition really was transformed into loving service and loving outreach and loving grace to share the gospel of the Lord with the Native Americans, and also with those eventually who might consider joining his mission and being a missionary themselves. Let's talk briefly in our closing minutes about the importance of bringing the truth as a missionary and as a faithful follower of Jesus to those around us.
Again, he gives us the example of how we need to be willing to witness to our faith daily. It might not be in the ways in which Junipero Serra did it. We're not going to move from one country to another to another. We may never baptize 6,000, some of those statistics from his life. But it really is just embracing the life of Christ and witnessing to it each day, and being willing to witness to it in a variety of ways, and to also be open to people of different cultures and different traditions. Sadly, in our current society, we might become more skeptical of people who don't look like us or talk like us or think like us or worship God the same way we do. But we still need to be willing to reach out and to offer that love of Christ to others. One of the great mantras in our service and our ministry is we don't serve or witness to others because they are Christian. We do so because we are. And that's our call as disciples of Christ.
And we'd like to lift up his life, that he was canonized here in our own country, very fittingly so. We remember him as a great missionary, not only to Mexico, but especially to the state of California and beyond. Thank you so much for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Saints of the Americas was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.